first. Tim Hernandez is an acclaimed author, poet, and educator whose literary pursuits illuminate forgotten histories and amplify underrepresented voices. He has been introduced as a Renaissance man. Hernandez is best known for his meticulous research and storytelling prowess, evident in works like All They Will Call You, where he meticulously uncovers the tragic tale of the 1948 plane crash, honoring the lives lost and highlighting the migrant experience. His dedication to reclaiming marginalized narratives extends to other works such as Mañana Means Heaven and Breathing in Dust, where he continues to explore themes of identity, belonging, and resilience. He's an author of 8 books of poetry, documentary novels, and his latest work, I hope it's okay to announce. The UA Press just let me in on it? Okay, sure. They Call You Back, A Lost History, a search and memoir. And I'm hoping that maybe you can touch on that a little bit. He is currently Associate Professor at the University of Texas, El Paso in the bilingual MFA in Creative Writing program, and he lives in El Paso. And moving forward, author of 6 books, Héctor Tobar is a Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist, author, and captivating storyteller celebrated for his poignant exploration of identity and migration. Trying not to be intimidated by these two here, but Tobar's literary journey spans across genres with notable works including Deep Down Dark, a gripping account of the Chilean mining disaster, which was adapted into a film, The 33, starring Antonio Banderas, in case you didn't know. And The Tattooed Soldier, a powerful novel set against the backdrop of Los Angeles immigrant communities. In Our Migrant Souls, which is what we're here to talk about today, Tobar invites readers on a deeply personal journey, intertwining family history with broader reflections on the migrant experience and questions the use of Latino to describe a whole spectrum of people. Through his lyrical prose and profound insight, Tobar challenges stereotypes and amplifies the voices of those whose stories too often go unheard, illuminating the complex experience of human resilience and belonging. Héctor is a professor of English and Chicano Latino Studies at the University of California, Irvine. And both of these amazing authors have written for many other famous publications. But without further ado, I think we'll want to start to hear from them soon. So we're going to start off the session today, if you don't mind, first, because I think since this is our first session here, we're going to respectfully acknowledge the University of Arizona is on the land and territories of indigenous peoples. Today, Arizona is home to 22 federally recognized tribes, with Tucson being home to the O'odham and the Yaqui. Committed to diversity and inclusion, the university strives to build sustainable relationships with sovereign nations and indigenous communities through education offerings, partnerships, and community service. I know we do these readings, these acknowledgements, but they mean a lot to me, and that we're setting the stage here for learning and listening to these stories, and it's important to acknowledge our ancestors here. All right, so I'm going to ask both authors, if they can, to please get us started with just a sampling of their works. So if you had to share what your books are about, to distill them into their essence, if you had to choose just one paragraph, which would it be? And if you wouldn't mind, please reading for us.
Well, for me, it would be the opening paragraph. I was really lucky. I got a year off to write this book from teaching, from my usual teaching. But it began as a result of my teaching. I teach at an institution like this one, and I have a lot of young Latino students, of Mexican, Guatemalan, Salvadoran descent, Puerto Rican, and teaching them and having them write stories for me, I just really feel a lot of their pain that they're feeling in a time of just horrible stereotypes about Latino people, a time of where so many people live with a mixed status, in a mixed status family, where there's someone in their family who's undocumented who are undocumented themselves. We have lots of undocumented students in our university, and so I wanted to write something that untangled how this happened. The story of where we are is an American story, a United States story, how we reached this place. My book is about how ideas of race, ethnicity, whiteness, blackness, brownness have evolved in terms of our country's growth, and how false so many of these labels are, and how they erase our pasts. So I wrote this during COVID, this first paragraph, and it was after my last class during COVID, listening to the last story, meeting with a student telling me about how they had to go back to work because their dad had been laid off during COVID and all these things. And so this is the beginning, it's the first paragraph. You write words for me to read, a string of memories that place me inside the eyes of the child you were. A daughter of Honduras, of Mexico and of Puerto Rico, and of the Central Valley of California, with its flat, dry plains covered with crops and cows, and towns filled with paisas and their chickens. You sit in my office and begin to weep as you tell me the story of your undocumented boyfriend and the demons that haunt him, and it is clear to me that you should break up with him, even though I cannot say this. You tell me about your best friend, a white girl, and about the African-American family who lived next door. In your stories, I see a suburb of rectangular lawns and a rancho in the rural United States, where the neighbors heard your mother and father yelling at each other, and where you took solace in the natural beauty of your surroundings, in the crisp desert wind and the muddy yellow outline of mountain ranges. You write, I am having a nervous breakdown, but your prose belies this. Controlled and precise, it tells the story of violation and survival you endured when you were a kindergartner. So that's the paragraph. Thank you.
Yeah, in thinking about that question, the seed of what I write about, if I could distill that into one paragraph, I actually think I want to share a little anecdote about this search. So the subject of my book, all I will call you, is a plane crash that happened in 1948, which killed took 32 passengers that were all aboard. 28 of them were Mexican-American bracero farm workers, and 4 of them were American crew members. And the newspapers reported the names of the 4 American crew members, called the 28 Mexicans deportees. That happened in my home community of Fresno County, California. And when I stood before the mass grave, suddenly I was pulled toward wanting to know who these people were. And I spent the last 14 years of my life trying to find all of the families, going between here and Mexico, back and forth for this last 14 years, And so the anecdote comes from that. It actually comes from 2015, the first time I went to Mexico looking for the families. It was on my last day that I was there. And on the very last day that I was there, I sat down. I was staying at the home of a bracero, an 80-year-old man named Don Miguel Perez. And he was sitting there. Every morning we'd have coffee and eat our little breakfast, and then we'd go about the day and I'd go interview folks in the community, and he'd ask me how it went. So on this very last day, I'm sitting there and I'm getting ready to leave. I had my bags packed. I had my last meal with him, some frijoles and eggs, and we're eating together. And he reminds me a lot of my grandfather, in that my grandfather would tell me these wild tales, and there were only 2 sort of perspectives, and one was either my grandfather would tell me something, and then I would be so engrossed in it, and then it would be a joke at the end. I'd think about the joke, and I would go, okay, Grandpa. Or the other time, it was so wildly, I think inventive, I just wouldn't believe it, and I would be like, okay, he's gonna tell me a joke, or make me the butt of the joke, and it would actually be something very true. And so that's kind of how Don Miguel was always sharing stories with me. I couldn't tell if he was being honest with me or telling me a joke. Well, this morning he says, so you got everything, he asks me in Spanish as we're eating, he says, so you have everything, did you get everything that you needed, from here? I said, yes, Don Miguel, yes. He said, everybody tell you the stories? I said, yeah, everybody tell me. And he said, did they tell you the story of the caballo, the horse? Did they tell you the horse story? And I said, the horse story? No, we're eating, frijoles, and I'm drinking our coffee, and he's got this big old hat on it. He says, the horse story, they didn't tell you the horse story? No, I didn't tell you what's the horse story. He says, well, he clears his mouth with coffee, lifts his hat up, and he says, this wonderful story. He says, back in 1990, right here in this little community in Guanajuato, Chaco de Pantojas, tiny ranchito. A farmer by the name of Daniel Rodriguez was tending to his field after a bad storm. After the storm, he's walking home through the cobbled streets, and he sees a stone upturned. And he goes, to help the community out, puts the stone back. And as he's putting the stone back into the road, he looks inside and he sees this giant. It's a hole. At the bottom of the hole is a bone. It's a skull. Okay? And so Don Miguel tells me, so Daniel at that point decides, I'm gonna start pulling the stones back. So he starts to pull the stones back, and he starts to see more of this skeleton. And it's this fully intact horse. And so, of course, the other farmers, Daniel, what are you doing? Why are you tearing up the road? And they just, come here. So everybody goes and gathers, and all the farmers are gathering around, and they talk and say, yeah, this looks like a horse skeleton, but it looks a little bit different. Like the head is oblong, the body, the front legs are shorter than the back legs. So then they kind of decide that it might be a prehistoric horse. So they say, well, let's ask somebody in this community who would know. Let's go call La Maestra. La Maestra was actually, her name is Diana Garcidueñas, and she was the first woman in that community to go off and get educated, come back and be the teacher. So they just all refer to her as the teacher, La Maestra. Let's go get La Maestra. La Maestra comes, she stands around, and she says, that's a prehistoric horse. Let me call my colleagues over at the university. So she calls her friends at the university, the local university in Guanajuato. They all come out with a giant VW. At the time, it was like a VW bus, and all these paleontologists come out excited, salivating, there's a horse, like a horse skeleton. So they arrive. The whole community by then is gathered around, the whole town is gathered around this giant hole in the ground, and they're all looking at this beautiful specimen. Paleontologists arrive from the university, and they look down and say, yeah, they whisper, that's a horse from the Ice Age. And of course the community's excited because that whole bullshit about how horses were not native to the land. They're like, well, of course we are. We're horse people. This is our horse. This is proof. This is native to the land. And in fact, not just to the land, but horses are native to Chalco de Pantoja, Guanajuato. So they're excited about it. So the paleontologists say, okay, great. Well, let's all dig it up now, and let's get the community around. So you guys can help us, lift this horse into the van so we can take it and we do studies. And everybody says, oh. What? You're taking the horse? No, you're not taking the horse. Okay, they tell us, well, we gotta go study the horse. No, this is our horse. No, this horse is ours. So then they go and they have a little conversation with La Maestra, the paleontologist. They strike a deal. La Maestra says, okay, all right, everyone in the community, she says, what these gentlemen have agreed to is that if we help them put the horse in the back of the van and carry it off, that after they're done studying, they're gonna return the horse to this community. They're going to put it in a glass case with some signage, and it'll be here forever. Everybody looks around and is like, good for you. Okay, good. So they all agree. So then they all help. They lift this horse up onto the back of the van. And there's these beautiful photographs of AmeriCorps at the time. They're taking photographs of the community lifting the horse out of its ancient bed, putting it into the back of the van. And then I have footage from different family members seeing the community waving by to the paleontologist as the van carries the horse off into the distance, and the horse is never seen from again. So then Don Miguel looks over at me and he says, can you help us find the horse? And I said, well, what made you think I'm looking for? I can't find horses when you found us. So I was flying home that next day, thinking about the horse story. Why would Don Miguel tell me this horse story at the very end of my journey? And the only thing that I can surmise, and this probably to me explains, I think, the seed of what I'm trying to do is, I think what he was saying to me was, when you take the stories from here, bring them back. And I think that that's what I'm trying to do.
Thank you. That's wonderful. Again, to both of you. So, I think with this story, we've heard a little bit more beyond what I'm going to ask, try to go expand on this. Both of your books delve deeply into the migrant experience from different perspectives. What drew you to explore this theme, and what do you hope readers take away from your work?
I think to live in the United States, no matter what background you're from, is you have a story of reinvention. We travel across this continent, or we come here from other countries, and I think that in that process, we're supposed to assimilate into this idea that all that matters is how much money we make, what kind of college our kids get into. We have certain measures of success, and we try to purchase property if we can, and live well. And I think in that process, we really have erased the things that connect us. And so, to me, I see this process happening with a lot of Latino people, where we think of ourselves as messed up. Oh, my parents got divorced, or I never knew my father, or my father was arrested, or I can't see my family because they're on the other side of the border. And so you have all of this pain that people have that is associated with this so-called broken history, a history of migration. And for me, as somebody who has been a devout reader for my entire life of American history and then world history, I've come to realize that that's just the human story. People are always moving from one place to another. There's always a journey. And that these labels that we've attached to ourselves are really the product of society trying to explain why there are rich and poor. Why some people live in nice suburban houses and others work in the fields. Why some people are nannies or sharecroppers and other people are entrepreneurs. And I just, and I know from my own personal experience too, that when you uncover your own history, when you study history, it's incredibly empowering because you discover all of the lies, all of the secrets kept from us. And so to me, untangling Latino, which is like this term in the media, you think of like Gloria Estefan or Cinco de Mayo or Trinco de Mayo, and all of these like really kind of superficial things that are supposedly Latino, and that's so empty. And yet we know that we're sort of tied by this shared experience. And so I wanted to write a book that got to the essence of that. And I'm very, very fortunate that there's been so much work done on the construction of race identity in the last 15, 20 years. So about the time I was writing this book, my wife, who's very, very Mexican American, was asked by her university to teach a class on whiteness. Because there's a whole bunch of literature on this. My favorite is the book, The History of White People by Nell Irvin Painter, an African American historian, who untangles this whole notion of white, because nobody really is white. It's like it's a misnomer, it's an abstraction, okay? How did this abstraction come to be? And so in reading that work, studying a lot of, African American history, my muse was James Baldwin. I wanted to write something like The Fire Next Time, which I think is this wonderful essay circa 1965, I think, about being African American in the 60s, and just this beautiful, angry poem, part memoir, part critical essay. And I wanted to sort of take, all of this experience, all of these lessons that white and black writers have taught us about how these race labels are formed, and apply it to this question, of being Latino, because now I would argue that being Latino is that's the critical thing right now in our country, because we have one political party. The main unifying force in that party is this idea that illegal immigrants, undocumented immigrants, are a threat. So, Biden gave his State of the Union speech. There was the reply from the senator from Alabama, young senator, the youngest senator, I think, in the Senate. And I turned on 30 seconds of it. And in those 30 seconds, she was talking about the crimes committed by an undocumented immigrant and how this woman had been killed. And it's just this, it's this horrible equating of us with murderers and danger. And in other rhetoric, with backwardness, with barbarism, right? The newest, most powerful, most prevalent genre in American television and film is the cartel movie. And if it wasn't for cartel movies, there would be like dozens of Latino actors who wouldn't get work. and so all of these, and so that's what I wanted to do. I wanted to sort of deconstruct that in a way that wasn't like angry and rhetorical. So if you read my book, it's a poem, just like I read. It's not me standing up and being angry about Latino, no. About being Latino, no. It's about how a good people have been taught these bad lessons about themselves, and that's why I wrote that.
Can you say the question again?
Yes. I know you get so proud.
Yeah, Hector's taking me to school right now. So what was the question again, teacher? I forgot.
I do want to say thank you for sharing your muse and why, because as I was reading it, I was like, wow, this sounds like a meditation. And I looked back at the
Yes.
cover and I'm like, oh, it's called a meditation. I mean,
That's right.
it certainly comes through all of that.
Yes.
So thank you. The question was,
About migration, how that was the theme of the story.
yeah, that you both delved deeply into the migrant experience, and what drew you.
What drew us? That's I think the part that I was concerned about. What drew us? You know, mine is a completely different approach. You know, I like to think that I'm not the kind of author who, or the kind of human who just goes around seeking something to write about so much as just trying to pay attention to my own surroundings. And when something finds me, I think of a writer who was influential, is the oral historian Ronald Blythe, an Englishman, who wrote a book called Aikenfield, Portrait of an English Village. And he basically went around Suffolk, it's sort of this, you know, quickly dissolving era, you know, the culture of his community, the agrarians, the people who are the milliner, you know, just all these folks. And he decided to ride his bicycle around town and just record their stories and document them, you know. Obviously, too, we also have the great oral historian Studs Terkel. I'm a huge fan of Studs Terkel's work. It's fantastic and so important. To me, it's, I was actually going to quote Ronald Blythe, and he says something like, my work is not the work of a trained oral historian, it's more the work of a poet. My job is to pay attention to my surroundings and just listen to my own world talking. And that influenced me a lot. And I think because I'm from the San Joaquin Valley, I'm the son of migrant farm workers and a grandson. My grandfather also was a migrant farm worker. Growing up in the San Joaquin Valley, trying to pay attention to my own world, my own surroundings, and suddenly this story just emerged. And like I said, it wasn't even the idea that, oh, you know, when I first heard this plane wreck and all these anonymous souls that were, you know, they were buried anonymously there, it wasn't like, oh, there's a book idea. It wasn't at all. It was just a genuine concern for, there's a what they called the largest mass grave in California's history at that time, in 1940. Here, a couple miles from my home, I have to go. So I went there and I stood above, and if anyone's ever stood above a mass grave, there is an intense gravity to that. Yeah, and so standing there, I just felt pulled into the mystery, and also knowing I have the resources to at least ask a couple of questions to find out who these folks were. And then in 2013, so I began the journey in 2010 when I found this newspaper article. And in 2013, we ended up, I found the names, a list of names of the folks who were buried there. And in 2013, I went to the cemetery director and we decided we should raise money for a proper headstone there because there was no headstone in this mass grave. So now that we had the names, we did that in 2013. We installed a headstone in front of the community. And everybody celebrated, and it was a wonderful moment. But I still didn't know who the people were. And when they lifted that sort of beautiful Mexican sarape off the headstone, and the community cheered, and the mariachis, and they released doves. It was just a beautiful occasion. And I was standing there, you can imagine, looking at all these names, 32 names on his headstone, and I thought, oh my God, my work has only just begun. I have to find out who they are. And so it was like that, getting pulled into the mystery continually. And for me, I think that the subjects I write about, I don't feel like the theme that I'm interested in is migration or even immigration. I should also say I'm the third generation born and raised in California on my mother's side, and on my father's side, 4 generations. So, you know, my Spanish is terrible, you know. and growing up, we had no connection at all to Mexico, you know, that we know of. You know, it was so far back. You know, only now that I've done my own ancestry did I find out. But at that time, I didn't. We had no such connections. And so, for me, it was, the subject was more dehumanization, I think is what I was concerned with. Because we see that playing out in various communities, not just the immigrant or Mexican American community, but Black communities, Asian American communities. We've been seeing that here for generations. That to me is the greater concern, is how we dehumanize another group of people or a person, today, and it's been going on forever. It just so happens that the community, my immediate community, the people I had access to, had that migrant experience. Yeah.
Tim, so as you said, your book explores this tragic story. So, and you started talking about how this was just beginning, right, when you went to see the massacre. So, what inspired you beyond just the moment, I guess, to uncover this overlooked piece of history, and what challenges did you face in your research process?
I mean, the challenges, I think I spoke to the inspiration, what inspired me, but the challenges themselves were probably the hardest part, because it was at that time, it was like 69 years. It happened 69 years past at that point, and so, and between two countries, so, and they were part of the Bracero program, so they were here, on a work visa, working legally, and then sent back. So at this point, generations later, the families could have been anywhere, between California, New York, Mexico, who knows where they could have been. They could have been anywhere. So the hardest thing was trying to figure out, first the names, because then my sense is, and I'll just say this publicly, I feel there was a cover-up. They reported 28 Mexicans. But there's been since some information that I found that show evidence of more passengers who later on they never appeared in any of the manifests or reports again. And in fact, I found one gentleman who came to me, his family came to me long after this gentleman passed away. His name was Yale Rodriguez, and he actually was there that morning, at the Oakland airport. And he said he was standing in line, and there were two airplanes, not just one. And that there were like hundreds of Mexicans who were being deported that day. And the reason why, we've since substantiated, his claim, because he actually did this interview, this really informal interview with his family on a video in 2005. 2005, well before my book had come out, before there was any sort of information really about this plane crash, and his family asked him a simple question on camera. They said, Yale, tell us about the time when you were a bracero. And he's just waxing poetic about the time of being a bracero, and they were doing this, and then the war happened. And as he's talking, he said, one time they even sent us back by airplane, I'll never forget. And there was this one morning on airplane, and then he starts talking about this whole thing, and there were two airplanes, and then one of them crashed and killed all these Mexicans. And I was supposed to be on that plane. They actually put me on the other plane. It was great, he's explaining this moment, and so there's all this information that, to me, just was very compelling, of course, and the mystery, of what was happening that kept pulling me into this. And so, I think that's, I don't know if that answers the question necessarily, but that's, to me, was the source. Okay. That's what made it difficult for me, was just trying to find pieces and fragments, but like a plane crash, this story appeared to me in fragments, which is what ended up determining how I write the structure of this book. I thought, okay, Truman Capote wrote In Cold Blood in the time it happened. He went to the town and everybody was alive and interviewed people. I could no longer do that, and memory is obviously so elusive. So I had to find ways to suture the story, and so I utilized the idea of fragmentation, like an airplane, the way you stumble upon a plane crash, and everything's in fragments, pieces of lives, and I'm counting on our own humanity to fill in the unknown of this story. And so I use a lot of juxtaposition, trying to put one story next to another to, suggest something or to make us think differently about, one of these. It was very difficult.
But your work is based on research, and since we're in a special collection where we have these kinds of materials, can you speak a little bit to, not to get us too nerdy into the research process, but I would love it. How did these interviews that you did, or histories that were, or other documents that you found, how were they helpful in putting together, suturing this story that you did? As a documentary and all.
Sure. In this story, there was no archive, except for one thing, and that's that there was one door that opened. And I always say, like, when the door opens, just walk through it, because all doors lead to the same room. you know. And the only door that was open was the door that Woody Guthrie opened for us. You know, it was the song. That was the documentation that existed. Woody Guthrie, you know. And then once I followed and walked in that door, I found the gentleman, the young man, a 20-year-old college student named Martin Hoffman, who took Woody's words and turned it into the song that Pete Seeger sang, and everybody under the sun has you know, sang since then. And that sort of, as long as I followed that thread, it started to lead me, continuing on, and then I started to find sort of research websites where everybody geeks out on Woody Guthrie's, you know, songs and stuff, and then all of a sudden someone posted, you know, oh yeah, my uncle was killed in this or something, and it was like, whoa. So you start to follow, and these are threads that go back like 15, 20 years almost. It's not when the internet was new. They were putting these like sort of chat rooms up, you know, and so that's how it began. And then so I started to have to, as I'm doing today, document every step of the way entirely. Began to carry a one-man show. It was kind of corny, you know. I was carrying around cameras and audio equipment and, you know, scaring people away with all this stuff, you know. And so I've been documenting all of this for the last 14 years, creating the archive. Yeah. Probably, I'll say too, one of the only things that did exist here that was very helpful was the Bracero archives at my university at UTEP. That they have the largest Bracero archives here.
Yeah. Thank you. Héctor, thank you for sharing earlier your inspiration, and I think it really comes through in your book. And I'm wondering, and there was, you know, I said that you integrated your own personal history into the book, but it's kind of more of a sprinkling.
Yes.
Yeah, and so I wonder if you can tell us how your personal experience shaped your narrative.
Well, yeah, you know, I started thinking about, as I was reading Baldwin, I was thinking, how did I lose my innocence about these ideas of race? Because I grew up in East Hollywood, California, very integrated neighborhood. My best friends were Armenian, Czechoslovakian, Filipino. You know, how was I introduced to the ideas of race? And then researching my own neighborhood, I remembered that I had read a book about the assassination of Martin Luther King, a book called Killing the Dream by Gerald Posner, whose books I highly recommend. He also has one about the Kennedy assassination called Case Closed. He's a lawyer who sort of takes apart these conspiracy theories and studies the history. And in reading this biography, which is kind of a biography of James Earl Ray, the assassin of Martin Luther King, it turned out that he lived on a street, Serrano Avenue, in East Hollywood. And when I looked that up, I realized it was right behind my house. And that James Earl Ray, this assassin, and we were neighbors. And I was 5 years old. In fact, I was celebrating my 5-year-old birthday when he was living in this apartment right behind the wall of our duplex. And he had a white Mustang, and he was planning to drive it cross country to kill King. He went to Atlanta first, then he went to Memphis. The famous white Mustang was parked in front. It was part of how the police found him. And I thought, oh my God, how crazy is this? And I started reading biographies of James Earl Ray, because a lot written about him after the assassination. And he grew up in extreme poverty in the Midwest, in Indiana and Illinois. In fact, he was born in the same town as Miles Davis. You know, and I looked up the census records for his town from the years. Now they're released after so many decades, right? And I found the census records for the census that was taken like 4 or 5 months before he was born, and he lived on a street, his parents, when he was born, with black people and with like Eastern European immigrants. And so he grew up really poor. So what James Earl Ray learned to hate was what was closest to him. He came to hate his poverty. He associated poverty with blackness. And so he became a virulent, anti-black thinker. He was imprisoned in Missouri. He read extensively about segregation in Rhodesia and South Africa. He wanted to move to Rhodesia, which is now Zimbabwe, to live there. And so killing King was his first blow against black power. That was his thinking. So I thought, oh my God, I have this story, I live next to this man. But then I remembered also the story of my birth. Because 5 years before that, in 1963, my parents arrived from Guatemala. My mother and father are teenagers, 19, 20 years old. My mother's pregnant. She gives birth to me at LA County General Hospital. But she told me, we didn't know anybody. We had just been in the country for maybe about 2 or 3 months. So that makes me an angry baby, according to the insults. And so she said, I was praying to this saint, this Afro-Peruvian saint, San Martin de Porres, who had just been canonized. And so she prayed to San Martin de Porres for somebody to take her to the hospital, somebody to look after her. And then she gets a knock on the door one day, and it's her African-American neighbor in this apartment tenement. And it's this black guy called Booker Wade. And she thought, oh my God, San Martin de Porres, this black saint, has sent one of his brothers to take me to the hospital, and he offered to take her to the hospital. Now, I knew that story growing up. I later wrote about it for the LA Times. And when I wrote this story, I said I've never met my godfather, because later he became my godfather. When my parents went to have me baptized, Booker agreed to be my godfather, dressed up in a nice new blue suit that he had. And that I never knew anything about him. I just knew that he was this black guy who showed up in his convertible to drive my mother to the hospital. And so I wrote this column for the LA Times, and the readers of the LA Times tracked down Booker Wade for me. And it turned out that he was like the manager of a public television station in the Bay Area. So I interviewed him for the first time, thank him of course for taking my mother to the hospital, and I heard his story. So how does he end up in East Hollywood in 1963? Well, he was an activist with the NAACP youth wing in Memphis, Tennessee. And so he and his, we're in a library. The Central Public Library in Memphis was segregated. And he and his fellow NAACP activists had gone to the library, the whites only library, Central Library, to protest this segregation, had been arrested. The police had driven him and his other activists around, threatening them that they were going to be get killed like Medgar Evers. So his mother, after he gets out of jail, says, son, I'm putting you on a bus to California. And she puts him on a bus to California. And so I discovered, in putting together this story and thinking about my own place in American history, that I was born into this history of black and white, of this virulent white supremacist and this black American activist whose lives intersected with ours. And I think that that's part of what being Latino is that we enter into this complex story where our lives become meshed with other people's. And so that's the beginning of how I got started in terms of the research and my own family story. And the picture you see here, if you buy my book, and they will be for sale along with Tim's, is this picture here. That's my mother and me a few months after I was born at the Griffith Observatory, the famous Griffith Observatory where they shot Rebel Without a Cause, that famous scene with James Dean. So my father took my mother up there and had a picture taken of her, and so that's part of the story that's interwoven into our migrant source. Thank you for asking.
Thank you. I know that we're coming to the point of Q&A, but we can take one more.
Yes, please.
Let's see. So your works delve deeply into others' lives and experiences, but I wonder, what did you learn about yourself throughout your journeys of seeking to tell the stories of others? And also, even because you've been talking about your books, right, for some time now, and I wonder if throughout that time you've learned something else about your experience.
I think I've learned the universality of it, because I wrote this book and I have so many young people and so many different Latino readers come up to me, especially, and say, I cried when I read your book. And that really moves me, because that's what I wanted to happen. That's what I was thinking. I was thinking, I want to write a book that makes people cry. Get yorin! And that's really moving. And also, in the process of writing the book, and I know that Tim, you're doing this in your next book, They Call You Back, which I had the privilege of reading an advanced copy of, is that, I also went back into my own story. And I went to my father's village in Guatemala, which is a place I've been to a couple of times, but once as an adult, but just like for 15 minutes on the train passing through. And I met all my cousins you know, like my second and third cousins, and I heard all these crazy stories of Hualan, Guatemala, which is a banana growing town, a banana plantation town in the eastern part of Guatemala. And I also just, you know, hear all these stories about Hualan. And in Hualan, there was this guerrilla commander once who marched the town, and he was Chinese Guatemalan. He was the son of a Chinese immigrant who had moved to Guatemala. And now in what, you know, and that part of Guatemala is almost famous for its beautiful women, which is a code of saying light skinned, because there's a lot of German immigrants who came to that part of Guatemala. And so you, and of course the black part, the Afrocentric part of Guatemala is like really close by the coast. So you have, so Hualan, this little, you know, farm town in the banana growing region is also this, you know, this place of mixing and meeting. And so that just gets, oh my God, this is a universal thing. Because I always thought of myself as this broken person. My parents had to migrate because my mother got pregnant. You know, my father, my grandparents are indigenous. I don't know anything about where they're from because they never talk about it. They said, oh no, we're Spanish, but they were so dark. You know, all of these like, you know, brokenness. It's like, how come I can't put myself together? And I realized in writing this book, that's the way we all are. You know?
Yeah, the universality I think is a real big one also for me. It resonates throughout my work as well. And, you know, because it wasn't just the 28 Mexican passengers that I went looking for, but I also wanted to know the stories of the American crew members. To me, that was just as important because erasure to any part of society is wrong, you know, and I wanted to get their stories also. It was just as important. And so when I began to interview the family of the pilot, Frank Atkinson, the family of the immigration officer, Frank Chaffin, you know, and then you sort of, the very next day, or even sometimes the same day, being on the phone and talking to some of the families of Mexican passengers who were killed. You know, when you do that over a long 14-year period of time, interviewing folks of different beliefs, different you know, geographic regions, and different families and traditions and rituals, you know, you start to, after a while, the chorus becomes a chorus of commonality. You know, we start to easily see at that point that underneath the skin, we are all the same. You know, we grieve, we love, you know, we have particular ways in which we love. We have dreams and hopes. And I was seeing this sort of, you know, this like I said, this chorus constantly to me, and I wanted to write that into the book. I felt like that was the most powerful lesson, if there is any, that this metaphor, this plane crash that was carrying all these different folks toward one common fate. You know, it was just an incredible story to tell, and so I wanted to learn about that. So universality is one, but the other one too, I think that I learned was also to trust my own instinct, and that was huge for me because I didn't study. I'm not a journalist. I didn't study investigations of any kind. I went to school to study poetry. You know, I studied my undergraduate and my graduate degree in poetry. It was just curiosity and a feeling like I could do something with this. You know. And so I think that I maybe could at the very least ask a question: who are these folks? You know, I could answer Woody Guthrie's invitation in his song. Woody Guthrie said, "Who are these friends, all scattered like dry leaves that the radio says are just deportees?" And I wanted to answer that, Woody. Let's find out who they are. You know, and those words, that invitation, sailed in the atmosphere for 60, 70 years by songwriters all over the world in different languages. Who are these friends? Long enough for the son and grandson of migrant farm workers from that town to say, I think I can try and answer that, you know? So for me, trusting my instinct, and I guess I kind of did have Woody Guthrie's voice sort of as this little angel, like on my shoulder. There was a time when I first went to the plane crash and there was a fence there at the crash site. And it said, I just said, no trespassing, you can't cross over. Well, I thought about Woody's lyrics, and he just on his earland, you know, he said, I saw a sign there, that said no trespassing, but on the other side, it didn't say nothing. That side was made for you and me. So I crossed through, you know? Yeah, definitely good there. Yeah.
But thank you both for answering these wonderful questions. But if there are questions from the audience, we have about 11 minutes or so. 10 minutes, according to Roger back there. 10 minutes.
So Chip, how do you think you gotta find the horse?
I found the horse, actually, yeah. It's in Mexico. It's in Mexico City. It's in Mexico. The horse is in Mexico City. Yeah, I had to actually go to Riverside to find. Yeah, I found this is kind of crazy. This is why you should start from where you are always, right? So I said, well, I'm a professor here at UTEP. We have some pretty good paleontologists here in the university. Let me ask this guy. So I don't even know who the professor is, the chair of the department, and I just sent him an email. I said, by any chance, do you know of any horse specialists in Mexico? That was all I asked, very general. And he responded like a month later, and he said, I only know of one guy, and he's the leading horse expert in Mexico, and he's in Guanajuato. And he sent me his name, and sure enough, it's the same name that's on these papers of this horse, and so it's Dr. Carranza, Oscar Carranza, and so I was like, wow, and he gave me his email. And that's how I reached out to Dr. Carranza and spoke with him, and I said, do you remember this story back in 1990 about him? And he said, I remember all of my bones. And I said, wow, okay. And then he said, that one had like one phalange missing, and he had it down. And so he told me that it was there in Mexico, yeah. And so, yeah, you'll have to read the book to find out what happened. They call you back.
And please wait for the microphone, if you don't mind.
Jim, could you read a poem?
Oh, you know what? Actually, this is a good opportunity to take. I actually am on a panel at 4 o'clock where we're going to be reading the poems. So please come to that. I invite you.
I might not need this. I know that a lot of the recent historical scholarship has sort of shifted to the borderland as the space for analysis, and it sounds like both of you are speaking to that in some way. The question, I guess, is more about the future. Do you think that the borderland will continue to be, the center for analysis and developing these narratives, or do you think there's something beyond that we're coming to?
And before you answer, if I may, just please put your microphone right to your mouth so that you can be heard. Not everybody, not all of us can hear as well, so.
Well, I think Tim lives on the border. This amazing town that overlooks Ciudad Juarez, where you can look into Mexico every day. I think that there's been a lot of research about the border because there hasn't been before, and because the border is this incredibly powerful metaphor. It's a metaphor for the way in which Latino people have this sort of split identity. And it's this thing that looms over the lives of so many people. I mean, I can't tell you how many times I've had a student come into my classroom and talk about a family funeral that took place in Mexico and how they all watched it on FaceTime because they couldn't go to the funeral. And in my own family, my aunt's comadre, she couldn't go to the funeral of her mother, and so she watched this during FaceTime, and it was really awful too. The last days of her mother, and all the sort of back and forth about whether or not she would visit, because if she left Pennsylvania and go back to Guatemala to see her mother before she died, she probably wouldn't be able to get back to help with her kids. So all of this, so I think that's one of the reasons why. But now, as the border is kind of everywhere. There are border patrol stations in Nebraska, Grand Island, Nebraska. I went there as a reporter when they opened the first one up in Grand Island, Nebraska. And there's border enforcement that takes place everywhere when they go into communities. And so I think that that really the increased studies of the border are related to that, to just that it being a defining part of sort of the American story right now. Right? So much of immigration policy is influenced by what's happening at the border and the drama and the spectacle which is happening there, which to me is a manufactured spectacle. But that's another story.
I really don't have much to add to that, to be honest. You said you hit the nail on the head about the space and what that, the one thing though I will say is that, every day living in El Paso, Texas is situated it rises up above the Rio Grande Valley in a way that Juarez is down below, so you can see it from almost any place that you're standing in El Paso. And so, one of the things that I've noticed more recently, anyways, in the last 10 years, is that it's producing an incredible amount of story gatherers, journalists, reporters, young writers, who are documenting their testimony, their families, and the people there who are doing it in various ways in multimedia journalism, and so you get video, you get social media sound bites, but they're documenting it. If you're able to at least tap into some of that, you can see that on the day-to-day level, what's happening there. And one of the most beautiful things about the area is that the people there are so, I feel like the El Pasoans and even the Juarenses, the folks who live, because it's two different countries, obviously, but they really function as one. They function as one. A good 80% of our students in the creative writing program, and I'll even say that goes far as saying at the University of Texas El Paso, live in Juarez, and they cross over every day. So sometimes when the politicians get mixed up and decide to shut the border down, half the university has to figure out what to do with the students. Sometimes the students are locked in on our side, so then professors and all that will kind of find ways to accommodate students. It's just an interesting daily reality that plays out there. And yet, I feel like that community is a community that has this perpetual yearning. There's like always a yearning, a longing for either the dream or for the return. We have Sunday mass services. Sometimes are at the border on the gate where you have community on one side and on the other side they meet with the gate in the middle, and the father gives a sermon in Spanish and then in English, and they all and then the families hug each other. There's this constant yearning, and so I feel like these are things that are palpable and tender about the border that we don't often see in media.
Well, yeah, and that's the other thing I could add is like these border towns, as many of you know, used to be really open places where people went back and forth every day and even organized baseball games and horse races across the line and whatnot. So that's the other part of it. Yes, absolutely.
Do you know Miguel Juarez? Okay, he's in El Paso. He used to be here.
Oh, I know Miguel. Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. He's at the university there.
Yeah.
Is he a historian? Yes, he's a historian.
Yeah.
Yes, okay.
Yeah, he used to work as a library here.
Okay.
But I'm almost 80, and we used to go to Nogales all the time, and if the border was closed, we just walked back over the railroad tracks. And talk about, like baseball games and all that, that's what I feel is so tragic that it's been lost. We had a home in Sonora for a while also, and so I lived this cross-border life, which, doesn't exist anymore, and it's just, and people that aren't from here don't realize that, they have no idea the rest of the U.S., and also how long it takes. My friend is talking, her mother, who was sponsored by her brother, just got her green card after 30 years. And of course people are going to cross illegally. It's going to take bloody 30 years to get properly documented to our legal system, and I don't think most of the people in the U.S. have any clue about any of that. And I know just from talking to relatives. Anyway, I just had to vent a little bit as I listen to you, because it's like it reminds me of all those times when we just went back and forth.
Yeah, and if you ever, if you like hiking and birding, you could go to the San Diego part of the U.S.-Mexico border. There's a beautiful, on the U.S. side, there's a beautiful park, Borderfield State Park, and it's just filled with birders. Go there, there's all kinds of species that you can't see anywhere else, but then you can walk through there. Sometimes you can drive, but they always find reasons to shut down the road. And you can walk to Borderfield State Park, which is one of the most dramatic places in North America. I've been there many times. And it's where the U.S.-Mexico border fence reaches the ocean. And it used to be, and you look at pictures from the 70s, and it used to be just this 3 strands of barbed wire. That was the fence. And there's this picture of Pat Nixon in the 70s when they dedicated Friendship Park on the border, reaching across to, a Mexican man is handing her a baby to kiss across the border, she's kissing the baby, And now, oh my God, if you go there, it's like this, I call it a conservative installation art project. Because it's like this stark, modernist kind of, architecture of like concrete walls and fences. And they still try to keep Friendship Park like what it once was, like once a week. But you have to go through like a series of gates to get up to the fence, and then there's this wall, and you can kind of like talk to people through the wall for like 6 hours out of the week, and then they close it all up again. And And so, yeah, it's a real, it's, the border is worthy of a grant.
And so I think with that, it's a good place to stop at this point. Special thank you to our authors for participating today, and thank you all for attending. Remember, book sales and author signings will be at the sales and signing area in the Integrated Learning Center. There's an elevator that takes you down. Stay safe. Thank you.
Thank you all for attending. Appreciate it. Have a good time.
Thank you.